he fondly refers to as Team Virginia Beach. So, Bob, I'd like for you to introduce our team.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, members of council, I'm very proud to have Team Virginia Beach here today. We have the most aggressive and successful intergovernmental relations program of any jurisdiction in Virginia, and that's at the state and federal level and the regional level too. And I've written to you before about Team Virginia Beach, but I brought all three of them here today, so if they'll introduce themselves.
I'm Brenda Roberts, and while I am new to the team, I'm not new to Virginia Beach. Prior to this, I was the district director for Congressman Scott Taylor, and prior to that, I was a legislative aide. Prior to that, I did some consulting, and I worked for Mayor Sessoms, as well as some other political clients and marketing clients. And I look forward to working with all of you and continuing to serve my hometown.
And I'm Angie Biesick with Principal Advantage Government Relations Group, and I'm really thrilled that Brenda agreed to come on, and none of you talk to her until she's too far in to get out again, please. And I have been representing the City of Virginia Beach in a lobbying capacity since 2006.
I'm Julia Carlo Hammond. I'm with Cozen Public Strategies based out of Richmond, trying to help supplement the team and when we're in session and then anything that's needed in Richmond. Cozen Public Strategies also is a law firm. We represent a wide variety of clients, and Virginia Beach being one of our favorites.
Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you very much for all you do for our city.
Well, I like to make the joke that y'all just finished your Groundhog Day event for the year with your budget, and so my Groundhog Day event is starting the General Assembly legislative package all over again. So I want to set the stage here. This all 140 seats in the General Assembly are up for election in November. That's all 100 House seats and all 40 Senate seats. And there'll be at least actually three changes, it looks like now, to our delegation. Senator Wagner, who's now going to work for the Commonwealth in the lottery office, is retiring after decades of service to the city and the country, but continuing his service to the Commonwealth. And Delegate Turpin is running to replace Senator Wagner. And the Delegate Lindsay will likely be leaving our delegation because of the next issue, which is the redistricting case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now. There are about 25 House districts, basically from Richmond down to Hampton Roads, that have been ruled illegal or unconstitutional, I guess I should say, by circuit court judges. And the appeal is in front of the Supreme Court. The conventional wisdom is because the court has not ruled on it this time, they're not going to take the case up. They're going to allow the district court decisions to stand because it's basically too close to the primary. But we won't know until we know. So need to do this myself here. Howard offered to do it, and of course I got it. So review of the 2019 legislative agenda. We provided in your package last week the wrap-up letter we did right after the session, and for the newer members of council, we also gave you the 2019 legislative agenda so you could see what it was like. And we were very successful last year. Voting rights, there's going to be pretty much uninterrupted early voting. Animal cruelty, Senator DeSteff's bill, the third time the charm that Councilmember Wood patroned made it into law. So now it used to be if you killed a companion animal, it was a felony offense, but you had to kill the animal. We had a case here in town where an animal had been cut up by a machete, but because the dog didn't die, it was just a misdemeanor, a slap on the wrist. So we worked very successfully, again, over a period of 3 years with the police department, Mr. Wood. Animal control came up to Richmond 2 or 3 times a year for the last 3 years, but we got that through. The governor signed it. Enabling legislation for the sales tax on internet sales. And that's going to provide money to Virginia Beach. We don't know exactly how much right now, but we'll get money back through the various formulas. Just me? Okay.
Oh, the serenade, yes.
The movie's coming out.
Very nice. Can I borrow that ringtone?
Right. The stranding
All right, you and I can
program
go see the
and conservation license plate, this was a priority for the aquarium in this last session, and Delegate Knight took it through the goal line, and they've already sold all 500, I think, of the required plates, so they'll be issued on July 1st. And there'll be money coming back to the aquarium. the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan. You know, several years ago, we had moved Lynn Haven and Little Creek from the James River Basin into from the Chesapeake Bay Basin into the James River Basin. Well, because of the Chesapeake Bay Act and the SWIFT program, we had to get legislation introduced to turn that back to where they empty into the Chesapeake Bay officially now, and that helps with the SWIFT program, and will probably save us literally several $100 million over the future with Chesapeake Bay Act program and the SWIFT program. Unmanned helicopter system. We had several occasions at Oceana where drones had actually flown up and down the flight line. As you might imagine, that's a threat to health, welfare, and safety. And Delegate Knight again carried the legislation, and we got that passed. The sales tax to flow to the dome site projects, that's about $500,000 a year of revenue that will be new for us that we can use to help with debt service. And the budget amendment to give a 100-year lease to the city for the aquarium parking lot across from the aquarium. And we're suggesting that we retain some of your long-term policy positions. The continuing to support the moratorium on uranium mining. That's another case. It's in front of the Supreme Court, and they should rule before the end of June. But we just don't know what the ruling will be. That court case is basically the owners of a potential uranium mine, wanted the feds to have control over whether they could mine or not, and the state says no, the state should retain that control. Menhaden fishing regulations, we're going to continue to support that. There's more and more evidence mounting up. Striped bass, for instance, are at a low point right now, and I think you can make a real direct case between overfishing of Menhaden into the striped bass at health. Certificate of public need, advancing high-speed rail. Councilmember Jones, this is an important issue for you. And for the rest of the council, we've been trying to get money for a Stage 2 environmental impact statement so we could get at least that much done to examine bringing higher speed rail to Hampton roads. That'd be both down the peninsula and through the south side. They've already done it from Richmond to D.C. and from D.C. to down to North Carolina, and we just want to make sure we don't get left in the lurch. And then aggressing sea level rise aggressively. And then possible other items, K-12 funding restored to pre-recession levels. In spite of the General Assembly's fairly aggressive stance, we think we have the numbers that show they're still not back to the funding level pre-recession in K-12 support to local governments. We'd like to see substantial increase in environmental funding. The governor proposed such funding, but all that money, basically most of it, if not all of it, was cut out of his proposed budget. Assistance to local governments for stormwater. Economic development assistance, that could be varied thing, deal closing money, transportation improvements, all sorts of things like that. And a long-term strategy for transportation funding. Gas tax, as you know, even though we've increased gas tax, General Assembly's increased gas tax, it's still a declining source of revenue because of increased fuel economy and the move, however slowly, but it's starting to reach a tipping point now to electric vehicles. And a lot of electric vehicles out there are basically not being taxed almost at all for their use of the transportation networks in the Commonwealth. And this is the schedule for our preparation. June 21st, a letter go to department heads and our boards and commissions. Councilmember Bellucci, we always got input from the Human Rights Commission. We go to the Planning Commission. We go to basically all the boards and commissions and try to get input from them for items that they want to have included. The review by the management leadership team in July. The first draft of the legislative package provided to City Council. That's a Friday. And then September 10th will be the first presentation to Council. We'll then have an interim there because of meeting schedules and the public hearing on the draft package, and then the proposed adoption on October 15th. What's the General Assembly doing? December 2nd, pre-filing will begin. Then January 8th, the session begins, January 8th of 2020. This is the long session, the 60-day session. And so they'll be adjourning sine die, hopefully on Saturday, March 7th. They've actually been doing pretty good the last couple years. It wasn't too many years ago that they didn't get out on time. They had to have special session after special session, but the last 2 years they've actually gotten out on time. And then discussion, any comments or questions, please, sir?
Mr. Wood?
Thanks. Well, Bob, first about the menhaden fishing, I gather that's just the amount of influence that omega proteins and those entities have with the rest of the General Assembly?
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Wood, they do a full court press. They have about 300 employees up in Reedville. They bring out the union supporters because it is somewhat of a union shop. But basically so they have both Republican and Democratic supporters of keeping the menhaden fishing as it is now. So,
Well,
yes, sir.
I mean, for the rest of council, it doesn't impact your districts as much as it does Lewis's and mine, but, these fish end up dead on the beach when they overfish, and frankly, the striped bass thing, the past 6 years has been declining, and honestly, the striped bass arguably has been one of the major indicators of a healthier bay, the resurgence of the striped bass, because when I was a kid, you couldn't fish for striped bass, then you could, it became a great recreational thing, but it cost us money. The fact that the striped bass fishing season gets cut off costs us money, not only in the fuel sales, all these other taxes, but it's also people who stay overnight that come here to fish because of the fact that the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel is a huge thing. So, I mean, that's something I think we need to keep in the forefront. We need to make sure that we support. I know that I think it was Barry and Frank actually put it forward last year.
And Senator Cosgrove also.
Yeah, so I think we need to keep, giving them as much support as we can because, I know it's tough for them to go against a big, the big money and everything they've got there, but this dramatically impacts people in my district and other places. The other thing is one that we talked about briefly last year, and that was the tax credit for film production and post-production and things like that is, I assume, I would imagine the council wants to take a positive position on that, but is that something that you see coming back forward?
Yes, sir, we could certainly pursue that. I've read the article about Mr. Williams pursuing television movie production here in the city, and that's certainly something. The film office already has a fairly aggressive program of incentivizing productions. The governor's made announcements in the past few weeks about Ethan Hawke's doing a series here in Virginia. We've obviously had a lot of films filmed here, like Navy SEALs a number of years ago, used our Prosperity Golf Course and things like that. But yes, sir, we'll certainly include that.
Well, and just to follow up on that, I understand that, but I remember that Pharrell Williams had a number of people from the General Assembly, most of the General Assembly, at his house, and the entire city council at the time, I believe, went to his house, and that was his pitch, was this is what we need to do. And the fact of the matter is, this guy produced Hidden Figures, which took place in Hampton, but was filmed in Georgia. And
Yes,
there's
sir.
just no excuse for that. So I think that's something we need to push forward. But, because to the extent that the city can do something, I'm sure we would, but these are state things, and according to the people who do the production, like for Williams, that the state doesn't do enough to entice filmmakers here, and so that's I wouldn't take it so much from the state film office. I take it from the people who actually are not coming here because of that. So
I think there's a real unique opportunity. Georgia has invested very heavily in film production, but because of some proposed code changes in Georgia, a number of networks, producers, et cetera, have said they will no longer do business in Georgia. Netflix is pulling out of Georgia, for instance. And there are a number of other companies that I think are considering it and may pull out in the next year or two. And so I think it's a
Yeah.
great opportunity
Yeah.
for us.
But if I could just piggyback on Jim, and then I'll get to Lewis and then Rosemary. When the Vice Mayor and I went to talk to the governor a couple months ago, we did bring up about the film production and everything. And there are other companies that are interested besides Mr. Williams to do this, and the fact that Regent University has a magnificent production, especially animation. I believe they did the animation for Toy Story and everything. And I met one of the actors in one of the movies a couple of years ago, Eric Roberts, who's been around, he knows his stuff. Basically, what he said, what is attractive about this area and why he would like to eventually somehow invest, that, with an ocean, with the inner city, and with a forest, you can shoot a lot of movie genres here. And, once again, this is an industry that I think would also help diversify our economy. And, Jim, I think the governor said, he thought this would merit further discussion, but, I think, if I don't want to speak on behalf of council, but it may not be a bad idea to pursue this aggressively. Especially, I think Rosemary just alluded to the fact that if they're shutting down in Georgia, that creates an opportunity.
Yes, sir.
So, okay, Louis?
On the K-12 funding for schools, is anybody in line to put a bill in to help restore that $30 million that they took away from us?
I think a lot of people are standing in line to put that bill in, but it's sort of like with the budget with everything else. There are a lot of members of the General Assembly, a majority at this time right now, that think they've replaced all the funding that was lost before the recession. Folks like the school districts, VML, and others have a differing opinion. So I think with the new General Assembly and the governor, this will be the only budget he'll actually be able to propose. So we sort of inherited Governor McAuliffe's budget and just able to make a few changes, but this will be the only budget he'll have that'll be his and all his, and I feel quite confident he will try to plus up K-12.
Okay, Rosemary, Michael, then Jim Wood.
Two things. School construction, where we used to be able to use the lottery funds for low-cost loans for school construction. Would like to pursue that again. And then, can you talk about the firefighters and the cancer bill?
There were a couple bills this last year that would expand and I can't think of the term right now, but basically assumed that a lot more illnesses would be considered career enhanced. That's a little bit of a sticky wicket because VML and some of the other organizations like VACO are somewhat opposed to expanding those definitions to larger groups because it's going to increase insurance payments. So obviously if council wants to support that, we will support it wholeheartedly, but we will probably be running against the grain of a lot of other local jurisdictions.
I think they remand that to JLARC to do a study to
Yes, sir.
understand actuarially what it's called presumption of cause or something. I think that's close to the name. And therefore, they're looking at the actuarially expense and whether or not what that would come at the expense of money for public education or money for this
So
stuff.
it's another study with JLARC?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
We probably need to wait and see what the study says. Thank
Good point, John. Good point. Okay, let's see, Michael, and then Jim, and then Barbara.
Thank you for your presentation and
Yes, sir.
for everything that you and your colleagues do to advocate for our city and the General Assembly. As a matter of process, I just wanted to say, as you noted, that I have participated in the process through the Human Rights Commission, and I know that that's an important component of developing the agenda and the recommendations. And when we think about transparency and accessibility in government, I think that's a very important part of the process, and it's one that I certainly appreciate. But I wonder if you would share a little bit more detail about addressing sea level rise from the suggested long-term policy positions. If you could offer any more detail about what exactly that entails.
That's pretty broad. I see the manager smiling down here. I'm channeling my city manager right now. We think long-term flooding, recurrent flooding, sea level rise is an existential threat to the health and well-being of not only our citizens, but our debt rating throughout the Commonwealth. Everybody east of the fall line is impacted or going to be impacted by sea level rise. the Commonwealth has to come together and identify it as something that has to be addressed, or not only will our local government tax ratings go down from our very cherished AAA that the state has, but the state's bond rating will also go down.
No question. I mean, I was just wondering if there's specific legislation or legislative priorities that would be included in that strategy.
Well, we're working on those almost every day. I'll give you an example. During the last session, there was a thought about doing when you go to closing, having to sign a document saying, hey, I understand my home is in flood zone XYZ, just a little more public information. I'm not sure that's the best time for that to happen because people, they sign a lot of documents when they close on a house loan, ACU's disclosure, things like that. They've got their house, their heart set on a particular house. They've already started picking out furniture and where the kids are going to play in the backyard. But I think we need to make sure that we can do things like the city's new policy on requiring developers to take into account sea level rise. I think we might need, and I don't want to get into the lawyer's bailiwick here, we might need to make sure that we have as much legal authority as a Dillon Rule locality to do that as we think we need. Money from the state to address, the various projects. You've got billions of dollars worth of projects need to be constructed. The city manager thinks the state should be responsible for half of the local share, whatever that happens to be. And I think that's certainly something that we should be pursuing also. So there's basically anything you can think of with sea level rise and recurrent flooding we're going to be addressing.
Okay,
So
sir.
let me pile on what Bob's trying to really get at, and that is, first of all, the education of our delegates and our senators to truly understand what sea level rise is. You all have been, several of you ran on that as an agenda item. Many of you have been involved in that in your districts and have felt the flooding impacts personally. And so the education of the citizens and businesses of Virginia Beach has been ongoing, and it's been ongoing for quite some time. And we're very proud of the amount of information that we've been able to share. And we will continue to educate ourselves and to share what the science is telling us, and we will also continue to develop the engineering solutions, which is a combination of both the hardened engineering and the environmental aspects that can support that. But it requires financing, and a huge financing, and you all are very intimately aware of this because I can't recall a meeting that we didn't talk about stormwater, to be honest with you. And so my exposure to the members of the General Assembly is they are not knowledgeable about sea level rise, and they are only beginning their education and their information gathering. But the harsh reality is that it is real, and that the polar ice caps are melting. You've heard me go into my spiel a million times. And the reality is they need to get with the program. And through the forums that we attend, I think it's becoming a more front burner conversation. And we are not going to be able to afford all that needs to be built. And so if you're sitting back as a jurisdiction thinking the federal government will come forward with a cost participation agreement of the old federal project, 65 federal, 35 local, you're in the cannabis trade because it's not going to happen. That's correct. So what's got to happen is exactly what this city government is doing, and that is stepping up and being able to create solution sets within your own means. And we are engaged in that process, and we are taking those steps forward. But eventually, the protection of the coastal region of the Commonwealth of Virginia is also a responsibility of our state. And because of the nexus to national security, it's also a responsibility of our federal government. And so proffering a reasonable cost-sharing arrangement long-term is going to have the answers that we're gonna need long after all this council is gone, long after this staff is gone, but in the decades to come as that sea level rise takes its greater effect and as it ramps up and the impacts here in the city. And so working out long-term financial solutions that preserve the economic vitality of the Commonwealth is the game we're in. Look, if we just wait for the state to step up, it ain't gonna happen. And we're gonna be waiting, and our citizens and your constituents are gonna be very upset that we're not doing anything. You are not choosing that course of action. You have chosen to move forward, take corrective action, and make things move in the correct. But eventually, your 15-year, $1.3 billion, your $2.2 billion investment through 2040 is going to have to be supplanted by another billion coming from somebody else, or we're not going to be able to affect those solutions, and we're going to need partnerships.
There's a meeting of the Hampton Roads General Assembly Caucus scheduled for August 28th, and Angie and the rest of Team BB, the smart part of it anyway, have been working really hard to get this very issue on the agenda, and we're reaching out to Northern Virginia localities. Right now, only Arlington, Alexandria, and Tangier Island have really expressed a lot of concern. We've been trying to tell the folks on the Eastern Shore that, hey, once you get off Route 17, 200 yards, you're going to be in a swamp in not too many years. And, I think y'all know yourselves here in Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, I think is way ahead of all the other jurisdictions in what y'all are doing to plan for sea level rise and recurrent flooding. And we have to get the whole delegation, the whole region, the entire state on board with this. So it's going to be a very costly process, and it's going to take a long-term and very determined effort to make it come to fruition.
Okay, we got Jim, Barbara, Aaron, Jess, and then Rosemary.
All right, so getting back to the whole education on sea level rise, it astounds me if you're saying people on the shore are not participating because they really need to, especially up there. And it's Route 13, not Route 17.
Excuse me, you're right, exactly. I make the same mistake every time I say that.
But the other thing that you've said it multiple times to me, and we've talked about it when we've gone to these flooding meetings, is people west of 95 in Virginia don't really care about sea level rise and recurrent flooding because it's not a thing for them. And that's part of the education process, because the dollars and the political will are going to come from all over the Commonwealth, not just from east of 95. But it kind of, the education piece and the logistics of all this kind of come into play. Flip back one slide if you wouldn't mind. So you talk about all these different things, and go back one more slide. All right, no, forward.
There we go.
You go. All right, so we're having a presentation on September 10th and a public hearing on October 1st and an adoption on October 15th, but it's still gonna be another month before we know who's actually gonna be in that position, and we know that at least in the 7th senatorial district, there's gonna be somebody new. We just don't know who it's gonna be. There are others, I think most of the races in Virginia Beach are contested, so I think, how do you do this? I mean, are we reaching out to both challengers on both sides and trying to educate them? Because then when you go back to their pre-filing dates,
Right.
there's not a whole lot of time. There's 30 days between the day they get elected until they're pre-filing, and I think if we want to influence that, I guess, how do you do it?
Are you
Well,
invite everybody?
Bob Crum with the HRPDC is putting together the Hampton Roads Caucus meeting, and we're making sure that he invites all of the primary winners by August 28th. So you'll have the candidates from both sides at that meeting. Once we get primary winners, I send out a lot of the stuff out of your package that comes to you on Friday. I send it out on Monday and Tuesday to the delegation. I will start sending that out to the candidates from both sides, just so everybody has the same level of information. So we will be informing them, and I know the folks over here will be whispering in their ears also, and we'll get the word out. Because it is an awful lot of, they're going to be drinking from a fire hose right after the election anyway. That's why we want to get in and get some thoughts put in their mind ahead of time, plant some seed corn, as it were.
Okay, Barbara?
Well, of course, on that same topic with the sea level rise, the big thing is funding, as you talked about. I know that we've talked in here often, and so is the regionally, the fact that the smart scale credits for transportation don't acknowledge resiliency as a factor. And I would think if there's any way to that, I don't know that the General Assembly has any input into what the smart scale points are, but the fact that we don't get points for a project that addresses flooding, safety or whatever you might call it, it's, I mean, now it's congestion for us. So, and that's going to be a mighty big factor for us in building roads and getting money from the state.
Actually, the state, we had a meeting a couple years ago, the quarterly VDOT meeting, and we were talking about Laskin Road, and somebody asked the state if they were designing Laskin Road to meet our flooding projection, our sea level rise, and there's like blank stares. 2-3 months later, the state put out a mandate that all future projects will take into account sea level rise. And so that's why we had to go back to the CTB once to get an extra 10 million or so. I think it was 20 million total for Laskin Road. That was just because of moving that bridge up to meet the projected sea level rise. So the state is taking some pain, some attention, but getting into smart scale, we'll certainly be working that up. Through the TPO, I think, is where that should, the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization, is where that should come from, and we'll certainly pursue it over there.
Well, if they're going to mandate that we build to that standard, I think they should help fund it. But I mean, this is where we are with Sandbridge, NEMO 7A, whatever it is. We've designed it to accommodate the sea level rise, but it's sitting on the shelf to be built until we get some money, because we have to do it all locally. It's another 2 years instead of if we could have gotten some state funding for it. So then but of course, all these other things that we had some funding for these kinds of things in our package that nothing got funded. But the Reggie opportunity, I think, was one to have some additional funding, but that died. I don't understand what the big reason was that folks are not willing to go along with that, because that's just an opportunity, I would think. I suppose it's going to still be in the packet.
Yes, ma'am. In this last session, Dominion was neutral when it came to Reggie, but there were still a lot of people in the General Assembly that remembered Dominion saying that Reggie would cost all the ratepayers money. Now, whether we get an equivalent amount of money back from credits or not remains to be seen, and the governor they did pass legislation that said without General Assembly approval we couldn't involve ourselves with Reggie. The governor could have vetoed that bill, but then that would have vetoed a whole tranche of money embedded in the budget. He couldn't pull out he could veto the bill, but he couldn't veto the money without affecting a lot more area across the budget. I fully expect it will be in the governor's proposal for the upcoming year, and it just, we kid ourselves as the rule of 72, 51 votes in the House and 21 in the Senate is what we need to make policy changes, and I feel fairly confident that's going to happen next year.
For those that don't know, can you explain, Reggie?
Yeah, Reggie is a regional greenhouse gas initiative, and basically we have something called like the Eastern Reggie thing, where you go in and you buy offsets for polluting, and you pay for those credits into a bank, and then that money gets redistributed within the Reggie jurisdictions or the Reggie states. Virginia would be the southernmost Reggie state. If we became part of it, it's primarily the northeast, east and north of here, just along the coast. At one time, they were talking about $300 million a year could come back to Virginia, and it was sort of earmarked for sea level rise and things like that. Now the money, I think, has gone down fairly precipitously, maybe to about half that amount, and without changes of the code, where it goes is still undesignated at this time.
But if it's new money,
Okay, Aaron?
maybe we need to educate our delegation, so.
Yeah,
not a tax increase.
First, I'd like to say I want to thank Delegate Knight and for introducing House Bill 2368 and Senator Wagner for that sales tax. We're going to get back over $600,000 a year in revenue for that, which is important when we talk about
Yes, sir.
the dome site project.
Yes, sir.
So, first, I want to thank him for that. But my key concern, one of the concerns I have is for the designation of micro businesses participation in Executive Order 20. Can you elaborate on that? How is that feeling in the General Assembly? Because I know we've kind of, Ms. Wooten here and I established a co-sponsor ordinance here to push that participation up to 12%.
We've had it in our package. The micro business redefinition has been in our package for 3 or 4 years now. Taylor Adams has been up to speak on it several times when he was in his former job. The governor has, I remember, vetoed a bill dealing with that in this last term. The governor is going through and they're redefining the various micro businesses. So we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that Administrative Process Act to go forward. We'll know before the session, and if we need to do some code changes. There was even some, y'all had in your package last year about changing the definition of small businesses, where we had a local businessman come in and say it should be 2 rather than 1 of 2, or two defining terms rather than 1 or 2, and that actually passed. We've had that, Delegate Davis actually put in the micro business this last session. He ended up having too many bills. He gave it to another delegate who was going to carry it for us, and the chairman of the appropriate committee in the House never called for it to be on the agenda. So we made a good effort on it, but gee, that P word got in the way of politics. So.
And who was the other delegate? Yeah.
Cole's delegate, not Cole's, Cole Trower's delegate. We're all, we're having a collective. Yeah.
You keep talking.
Yeah.
So do you think that the definition of a small business will change either from 10 million or?
I think with the code change that just happened, they're not going to change that definition again anytime soon. Now, the micro business, they may change that definition, and the state's gone back and forth about what a small business, a micro business was, and the state folks that run that program were not too keen on changing the definition. Not trained, no. The really old guy.
Anything else, Aaron?
No,
Yeah, Ronnie, Delegate
Yes.
Campbell, I'm sorry.
Campbell.
Yes.
Yeah, Jessica?
I had a question. Well, it's not really a question. Well, it kind of is a question. So one of the things that I wanted to see in the packet this year is some kind of mandatory notice for properties that have been that are now classified through FEMA as a severe repetitive loss property. For those of you who don't know, you don't find out you've purchased a severe repetitive loss property until your FEMA policy has been underwritten, which is after you've paid for it and after you've closed. And I, last year, underwrote 3 of them. Insurance agents do not have access to that database. FEMA keeps it closed. The only way you know you're in a severe repetitive loss property is if the owner was the one it fell under. So, there are cases where they were designated as severe repetitive loss before Matthew, and the homeowner never changed. And so until you've closed on your house, you don't know that you've got an enormous flood insurance bill because they're now a severe repetitive loss property. So I think it is. That's what my question is. How do we go about requesting, I don't know if we need to go to Congress and say, hey, we want to make sure that if we're going to be seeing sea level rise and anticipating all these increases in flooding, how do we make sure that people buying property here know what they're getting into? That's my big concern, and I don't know if that's a part of this process, which is my question, or if it needs to go to the General Assembly and then somehow goes through them to go up to FEMA.
Well, it probably would have to, we probably have, from the little bit I know right now, we probably have to start with the feds being able to tell the state about the property and then have the state pass legislation to require that to be disclosed at closing. So if it's kept in a lockbox at the federal level, anything the state does can't change that. We'll need to change it at the federal level.
Well, my understanding, Dave, is doesn't the city have access to that information?
Yes, we do.
So
Okay.
is it, but we can't just release it.
No,
We're
we
subject to
cannot.
disclosure requirements.
Yes,
It's
sir.
You'd have to go to the Office of Management of Budget or Regulatory Affairs jointly with FEMA, because FEMA would have to issue in the Federal Register. First, they have to hold hearings about a regulatory change. They'd have to advertise it in the Federal Register. It then would come back with an analysis with a recommendation. It would then go to the Office of Management and Budget for pre-clearance, for allow it to be approved. It gets White House vetting, and then they could issue a regulatory change if it wasn't statutorily prohibited. And that is the process that takes.
We better start last week, so.
Got it.
Count on 18 months, minimum.
Okay, Jess?
Well, yeah, I just think we need to start looking at what that's gonna look like, especially if we anticipate that becoming a bigger problem down the road. Because it's not real fair to get a bill after you buy your house.
Rosemary, then John Moss.
So last year, this council unanimously supported the ERA, and so I'd like to see that as part of our.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, John?
I want to go back to slide 4.
Yes, sir.
I know the oral arguments have been completed, and therefore the filings are on record. This is the moratorium on uranium mining.
Yes, sir.
Which has its most significant asset, the most important thing, even more so than flooding, is water to drink. So I put that high on our list. It has always been, thanks to the Mayor Jones when he was vice mayor. But so we ought to have some idea of what we anticipate. This is basically a state, federal kind of who has jurisdiction over what kind of issue. So as the reading is, it's likely to be remanded. Since they took the case, they're going to obviously rule on it. So either one, they're going to rule to send it back with instructions, or they're going to rule. So all the people who are the tea leaf watchers, and I haven't had a chance to research it, but they're out there, what do people see as the tea leaves on this? Remanded back to the lower court with instruction, or do we actually expect a decision?
Can we take that as a homework assignment and get you an
Can.
answer by Friday?
Please, that would be great. And it could be longer if it takes longer. It's not a, obviously they finish off June 30th, so they ought to be rolling these things out. So, and in fact, if it happens and it's not favorable, the time, contingency plans are always good. So I'll be thinking about that. This certificate of public need was hotly discussed, and one of the concerns was we did not yet have Medicare for all in Virginia, and that was one of the big complaints of the hospital industry, that somehow they were going to be disadvantaged. Well, that has been solved, so I think we need to revisit what competition brings to the consumer versus what protectionism brings to the hospitals, and what they're now, that same condition they complain about has been removed. So I'd like to see that discussion revisited versus just assuming it's correct. You answered my question about what the long-term strategy for transportation funding is, but have they designated a committee? Have they asked JLARC to do something? People, I know there's been discussion about everybody pays an odometer and get rid of the gas tax altogether and just go to odometer taxes. There's a whole bunch of things that have been looked at. And that's at a federal level, they've been looking at odometers as a way to collect, charge. But I think for us to have something for consideration, I'd like to better understand, what's happening there.
I know Oregon is doing a miles-driven pilot program. I know the state is looking at it. They charged the secretary with examining some options and reporting back to them.
Well, can you just share, when that stuff comes available, would you just please share it with us? Because I think this could affect people's pocketbook, and they just need to know how that is and that the benefit's worth the gain. And one of the things we didn't talk about, which is a big thing, is that the Medicare, the portion that the state has to pay, has been rising faster than what they had expected on the people who aren't covered by the extra federal coverage but are still responsible to the state. And that caused a big
$500 million
hole to fill
problem.
in this end budget, which
Yes.
we didn't get as much money for education as we thought. So I'd appreciate any education in the future you could provide to us. And if on slide 6, I would assume anytime between June 21st and before September 6th, then any council member can suggest their own legislative item they'd like to be included in the package, is that
Well,
correct?
certainly, when the memo goes out to the department heads and the boards and commissions, y'all get a copy of it, and it specifically says, for y'all to put in your input. And as some of the council members may not be aware, no item goes in the legislative package unless a council member sponsors it. So nothing comes just from the staff. Anything we cut from the staff has to have a council member as a patron.
And if on slide 7, if we could add in the crossover date, since that probably should be known, that's an important date in the
Yes, sir.
legislative process. And I don't know if we can conclude, if it ends on the 7th, there's also that veto session date. That's a prescribed, assuming they end on time, of course. That would be helpful, at least for citizens who are looking at it, they can see the end to end, since a lot of stuff emerges in that cross-section that no one's seen before.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anybody else at this point? Bob, I'm going to make a suggestion, and, for council, we can discuss this in the future. It wasn't, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
Mr. Mayor.
go ahead.
I had just one question. I know you said we'll know when we'll know on the redistricting.
Yes, sir.
Is the expectation that it'll happen before the June term adjourns? I mean, they normally adjourn by the end of June.
Yes, sir. And again, I'm going by conventional wisdom, what I've read is because they haven't ruled so far, they're not going to rule on our case. Now, they probably will rule on the congressional redistricting case. Last week, they punted on a case, but that's because they've got 2 or 3 other cases they're looking at. Yeah, no, they're due by the end of June. Yes, sir. If I were a betting man, I'd say that the Virginia case is going to stand as it is now from the courts, and I can't predict what they're going to do with the congressional redistricting cases because I think they felt a lot more comfortable going into into General Assembly redistricting than they did into congressional redistricting because that's control of the known universe when you get into Congress.
Thank you. As a follow-up, I'd just like to make one observation. As someone who lobbied part-time but actively for 6 or 8 years in Richmond, I thought the description of the Virginia Beach lobbying effort was absolutely right on the money.
Thank you.
I spent most of my time in courts of justice, but I got out enough to kind of know, so a third-party objective voice that
Thank you very much.
doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, but Bob, once again, I think, if you don't mind, we used to meet with the delegation and the school board. I don't think we have done that in a couple of years. And we submit this document to them, but it's a faceless document. I think we have to get them in the room together and know what our priorities are. They have to know what our priorities. We can't, as the manager said, we're going to have a lot of bills to pay. And the school board has, they got a $3 billion requirement for school modernization and replacement. We got to get them on board. So I really suggest that we have a face-to-face, the 3 bodies get together. And, we have to convince them what the priorities are.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, one more point, forgot. This is the SALT. I know this is the state and local tax limitation in the new federal tax code. I know in November, everybody's going to get this, or October, just before the election, this $200 bonus check per tax filer. Just timing, I'm sure, is coincidental. But
Very coincidental, yes, sir.
But the impact of SALT is not. For those of you who haven't, when you filed your taxes, experienced that you weren't able to deduct any of your local taxes at all, and then Uncle Sam wanted 25 to 31% of that amount in addition to, it does really represent a real reduction in discretionary income of people who spend money and have discretionary income. And I know they're looking at that. I think JLOC was looking at what the permanent fix to that, but I'd be interested in how they're looking at that because I know that was an issue they deferred until the 60-day session. But that will have an impact on people's fiscal capacity and reaction to our increase in taxes when they have to pay a federal tax on a local tax that they cannot deduct.
Well, that obviously goes to the whole Tax and Employment Act or whatever. The individual taxpayers' tax cuts go away in another 6 years or something like that. So we'll have to wait and see with all that.
Okay, thank you.
Tax doesn't.
Thank you all. This was a very important discussion. Thank you all for participating.
Thanks, everybody. Julia, Angie, and
Brenda.
thank you.
We're not gonna get through all this today.
All right, next we have, we're gonna focus on a very important project that we've been working on. The lakes, Princess Anne Plaza and Windsor Woods. And we're going to have introduction by Mr. Leahy or Mark. Who's doing it? Mark, okay, of our consultant today. And hopefully this will be informative to you, but it's, of course, as we all know, it's one of the hardest hit areas that we had from Hurricane Matthew. So go ahead and launch.
Okay, Mayor Dyer, Vice Mayor, council members, thank you for letting Public Works come here. Give you a brief on, I'll say, our biggest stormwater project, the lakes, Princess Anne Plaza, and Windsor Woods. Previously, you've been hearing from us through our quarterly reports, giving you a status update. We've been working on this project for 2 years. We've been visiting and coordinating with the community for over 2 years. We're at a point where we want to come to you, show you what we've done, and show you where we're going. Today, we have with us our consultant team, Michael Baker International, Fred Muncie, and Mr. Clarence Warnstaff. And Mr. Warnstaff will give the presentation. I've worked with both of them throughout my engineering career, and I worked for Mr. Warnstaff when he was Public Utility Director. So with that, Mr. Warnstaff, please come up.
Fine, thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. Mayor, members of council, thank you for your time this afternoon. I know you have a very busy schedule. We want to give you an overview of this very large project, and Mr. Mundy is going to operate the slides for me. Today, our agenda is to talk about the project background, why are we here today, what were the circumstances that drove us to this point. We're going to talk about the level of service, which is, in essence, sets the standards that we receive from Public Works that we should design to and come up with recommendations. I want to talk about the major program elements. Whoops. I don't think so, but I'll do that.
Tony, grab that thing.
There you go. Thanks, Tony. Because I like to use my arms when I talk, so. If you could go back one, please, I'll, on the agenda. One more. There we go. We'll talk about the improvements that we've identified and the phasing of those improvements. Talk about FEMA. FEMA is important because the residents in this project area are paying very, very high flood insurance rates. And one of the objectives of this program is to put those residents in a position where they can seek much lower rates. Actually, I don't need the slides. I can just talk all the way through it.
Mr. Wood. If I could just for the benefit of the people at the other end of the table, Mr. Warnstaff used to be the Director of Public Utilities for the city, so he comes to us with a great deal of experience and credibility, so just wanted to mention that.
It's a pleasure to be here, to be back. And then we'll wrap up with a summary.
Mike Cotter, welcome back, Cotter.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, the next slide is really an overview of the project area. It really consists of 3 capital improvement programs, Windsor Woods, the Lakes, and Princess Anne Plaza. But for the purposes of our analysis, they were joined together as one project. You can see it's a very large area, almost 2,600 acres of land, fully developed, and over 8,000 parcels of property. So it's a very, very large area right in the center of our city. And the approximate assessed value of properties is around $2 billion. Next slide, please. Several things that in our analysis that are important for us as engineers to recognize, and that's the natural drainage patterns. You can see that the water that falls in this area, as with any neighborhood, the question is, where does the stormwater go? I've met with residents and they say, I ask them, where does your stormwater go when it hits the streets? And they don't know. I said, well, it's going to go someplace. It doesn't disappear. So it's going to go to a receiving stream. In the case of this neighborhood, for the Windsor Woods portion of the project area, the water generally will flow into Thalia Creek and into the Lynn Haven Bay. For the Princess Anne Plaza and the lakes, the water is going to wind up in London Bridge Creek and West Neck Creek. The tidal influence is interesting because you would think a neighborhood in the middle of our city would not be influenced by the tides, but it is. It's influenced by Thalia Creek, which is connected to the Lynn Haven Bay. It's influenced by London Bridge Creek, which is also connected to Lynn Haven Bay. So in a 24-hour period, these bodies of water experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides. And those tidal influences impacted our recommendations. Next one, please. The background. Well, elevations in the area are very low, and I'm going to show you a map in a few minutes that really demonstrates this. Most of the homes in this area are built on what we call slab, where concrete was poured on the ground as the foundation for the home. And there's really not much difference between the elevation of the home and the elevation of the street. As I said, it's influenced by the tides. We've all recognized that there has been an increased frequency of intense storms. This is backed up by scientific evidence as well as what we have observed. Infrastructure is about 50 years old. These neighborhoods were built back in the 1960s. The storm drains are inadequate, and in some cases, they simply don't exist. And lack of stormwater storage. When you get an intense rain in this area, there's really no place to capture this water and manage it. That's one of the issues that we had to address in our recommendations. And of course, flood insurance rates have been increasing dramatically. Some residents that I've talked with pay $500 a month for flood insurance. And our goal in this is the end result of this project over a long period of time is to put those residents in a position where they can petition for much lower rates. Next slide. Well, if no improvements are made in the neighborhood, if we just leave it as it is today with no improvements, our analysis and our computer modeling indicate you'd have 978 structures would flood during a 100-year design storm. Now, a design storm of that nature brings about 10 inches of rain over a 24-hour period. That's a tremendous amount of rain falling in an area in a short period of time. We estimate 978 structures are subject to flooding with no improvements. Additionally, 15 miles of roadways within this project area would also be subject to flooding. I want to give you a definition of what street flooding means. It means that it's a street where you have more than 3 inches of water on the crown of the roadway. Next slide. We call this a risk assessment map. The areas in red represent the lowest elevations, and they are at the highest risk of flooding. Say that again. The red is the lowest elevations with the highest risk of flooding. Just the opposite, the blue elevations, which represent the high elevation, have the lowest risk of flooding. If you took a FEMA 100-year floodplain map and laid it on top of this map, it's the red area. So back in the 60s, people didn't recognize, except maybe for the farmers, that this area was wet a lot. People didn't know that it was in a 100-year floodplain. Those maps didn't exist in the 1960s. So today, we're trying to come up with solutions to address issues that were made 50 years ago. So you can see, and also it was mentioned Hurricane Matthew, which had dramatic impact on this neighborhood. The homes that flooded, they're in the red area. And I wanted to comment.
That's just one question, just to make sure I understand.
Sure.
On the 100-year rain event.
Yes, sir.
Are we using the current standard that FEMA uses? Because there are new standards that are out there, like we've been using for our own policy plan to adopt with different rain events. So I'm trying to understand when you say a 100-year rain event, you did define what it meant.
We're using the FEMA's current standards, which is about just a little bit under 10 inches of rain in a 24-hour period.
Just slightly, if I remember, lower than what we have now as proposed, correct?
Yes,
okay,
sir.
I just want to make sure everybody knew that there was.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Yes. I wanted to point out that in the Windsor Woods area, for a 100-year storm event, you'd have 357 structures flood,
And in the plaza, in the lakes, you'd have 621 structures subject to flooding for a 100-year event. Next slide, please. I want to talk about level of service. The level of service was provided to us from Public Works, and in essence, it sets the goalpost for us. That's the objective we were working towards to achieve. And for a 10-year storm, that's one that occurs, has a probability of occurring in any given year, 10%. We should limit the amount of water on the roadway at the crown to 3 inches or less. For a 100-year design storm, no flooding of structures. That's our goalpost. Let me compare that to the current city standard. The 10-year design standard basically says no flooding of streets. And for the 100-year design storm, streets shall remain passable and no property damage, which means no flooding of structures. With a modified level of service, you're going to have a little bit different outcome, even with our recommendations. There will be flooding in the streets, and I use the word curb to curb, for a 10-year event. Streets are used as, in essence, storage and as a conveyance of the stormwater. And in some structures, and significant street and yard flooding will occur during a 100-year event. This is a tough issue to resolve. We are working in a 100-year floodplain with very low elevations, and there is no silver bullet to correct a problem that occurred 50 years ago. Next. Yes, sir.
We're talking about curb to curb, if I remember, this gets the picture, because now.
No, this is an illustration. This is a graphical illustration, sir.
But if I understand correctly, because right now we have those flash curbs that don't provide any vertical stop point for the water that just moves, splashes up and rolls into the yard. I thought I read somewhere at that one point that we would be regrading the streets and there would be the standard vertical gutter to create that capacity in the street to hold water and serve as a conveyance of floodwater. Is that still correct?
Well, I might refer to Public Works, but I know that in the process of installing new storm drains in many of the streets, the street's going to be torn up. But I will defer to Public Works to respond to that question.
We would look at that when we got to the, I'll call it the outer phases of the project, where we start looking at the
Fair
pipe
enough.
systems.
I know we are tight for time, so I'll
Yeah.
wait, but you know my concern.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
This is a graphical illustration. It's not an engineering drawing, and it's not drawn to scale, but I want to just share with you the fact when you have about 3 inches in the middle of the road, over the curb level, you can probably have about 8 inches and possibly some spillover into the yards. As I indicated, in some cases, in some streets in the neighborhood do not have storm drains. It's on slab construction, and the elevation difference between the street and the home is small. And it has presented a monumental problem to us in terms of solving those problems. We're trying to drop water levels inches, 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 and inches to keep it out of the homes. Next slide, please. Well, the infrastructure improvements that we've identified fall into 4 categories. First one is tide gates and barriers, and I'll talk more about those in a few minutes, but the tide gates are going to keep the high tides from coming in. The way the system will work, in advance of a major storm event, with the tide gates in place, Public Works will close the tide gates at low tide, and that blocks the incoming tide. If you didn't block the incoming tide, the storage that we're going to create would be in essence, I use the word stolen by the tide. So you want to block the high tides in advance of a major storm event. Now, under normal circumstances, the tide gates are going to be open. It's only in advance of anticipated storm that Public Works would close the tide gates at low tide to prevent the high tide from coming in. And also the barriers work with the tide gates to prevent high tides from coming around the gates and coming in on the sides. Large capacity pump stations, and we've identified 2 of those. These will represent some of the largest pump stations in the city's stormwater system. They're incredibly large pump stations. And we need additional storage capacity, which is critical. You've got to have storage capacity to capture that large volume of rain so you can manage it. If you can't manage it and store it, you're not going to be able to control it and keep it out of people's houses. And then we have storm drain improvements that would be throughout the neighborhoods. Next slide, please. This is a concept map that this has been presented to council in previous meetings on your quarterly updates. And it's a layout, it's a high-level layout of the 4 infrastructure categories. You can see up at Thaley Creek and at Lake Windsor, we would have a pump station, a tide gate, and barriers. Moving over to Princess Anne Plaza, North London Bridge Creek would have tide gates and a barrier. Moving down to South London Bridge Creek, at Westneck Creek, we would have some channel improvements and a barrier in tide gate, but not a pump station at the south end. So those kind of create what we call the bowl, so to speak. It's the tide gates and the barriers create and eliminate the external influence. The external influence is the high tides. We also need to have storage. You notice in the Windsor Woods area, we have Lake Windsor and Lake Trashmore. We're able, if we can stop the incoming tide, we can create storage in those 2 lakes to help manage the stormwater flow. If you look over in the Princess Anne Plaza, in the lakes, there is no Lake Windsor. There is no Lake Trashmore. There are some lakes down in the lakes neighborhood, but they're fairly insignificant and immaterial to our analysis. Fairly insignificant. So we've identified 2 areas potentially for stormwater flood control. One is the Bow Creek Golf Course, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, in North Cape Plaza Park. And storm drains, as I indicated, would be installed throughout the area. All that together, at this time, we estimate $354 million for all 4 categories.
And can you tell me, Mr. Mayor, how much additional gallons of storage that is? Because 10 inches of rain on 2,000 acres is 70,600,400 gallons of water. So it is interesting to know how much storage capacity are we creating with the situation with $354 million.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
Yes, sir.
I may not have those numbers at my fingertips, but I can get them for you.
All right, later will be good.
This is the concept. It's referred to as berm, pond, and pump. And what this basically is, this concept has been used in other cities across the country. I use New Orleans as an example. They use levees to keep water out of their city. They're somewhat in a bowl, and they use pumps to collect the stormwater and pump it back over the levees. And this is similar to what we're going to do here. We're going to have the tide gates and the barriers, blocking the external influences. But when it rains within the project area, you have to collect it, you have to manage it, and eventually you got to pump it back over the tide gate, back into the receiving stream, which is Thaley Creek and North London Bridge and South London Bridge Creek. So those work as an integrated system. You take any one of those out, and it doesn't work. Next slide, please. I talked earlier about Windsor Woods, the plaza, and the lakes. In the current CIP, there are 3 CIP projects for this area. For the CIP that this council adopted a couple weeks ago, becoming effective July 1, there are 9 CIP projects. The public works staff went from 3 to 9. Number 1, the reason is transparency, so it's clear to the public where the monies are going to be spent on which public improvements and the cost. And secondly, it allows the city's financial system to better track the cost by project. It's the same project, but instead of you having just 3 large CIP numbers, we're going to wind up and have 4 for Windsor Woods and 5 for the plaza and the lakes. And these CIP numbers are in the new CIP, which becomes effective July 1.
John?
Could you go back to the Windsor Woods, please, just
Yes,
for a
sir.
second?
Certainly.
That goes underneath Virginia Beach Boulevard. That's where that water has to push.
Yes.
And on any given day on a normal high tide, there's only about, at most, 2 feet clearance between the water flow and the spare concrete. So only so much water can move between there no matter, and at the high tide, it's totally, a surge high tide, it's full.
Right.
So I'm curious in your modeling, as you show the pumping, because you don't show pipes going underneath and
Right.
taking the water further.
Right.
So are you actually gonna have the velocity on that pump that you can move the volume of water that the pump is pushing underneath that constrained orifice underneath the boulevard without causing the water to rise on the shores and flood the adjacent property? And you have actually modeled in that space that won't be available at all, you're now pushing water against water a great distance.
In our analysis, we recognize the water levels that exist today and the capacity of the floodplain. The way the system will work is that there will be monitors along Thalia Creek to measure the water levels. And the pumping at the Windsor Woods pump station will be regulated to ensure that the pumping of the water downstream does not make the flooding worse. Now, I chose my words carefully. There may be flooding downstream, but it's not going to be caused by this project.
So you've modeled so that the gallons you can move per minute or whatever the
Yeah.
standard measurement is sufficient to push it through underneath the boulevard,
Right.
fully done
Yeah.
and move it down without
Okay.
flooding the external
See,
properties. Okay.
the Public Works told us right up front, if you come up with a solution set for this area that causes flooding in other neighborhoods, that's a no-no.
That's a good point to constantly make with the public.
Well, my point, though, is, but residents have asked the question, sir, similar, regarding the pumping of the water. One of the things that the residents didn't fully realize, in the absence of any improvements, that's where the water's going anyway. It's going to go into Thalia Creek, and it's going to go into Lynn Haven. It's going to go into London Bridge Creek, into Lynn Haven. Well, we have simulated and modeled those peak rates of discharge, and the pumping scenarios that we have been modeling will be less than what Mother Nature could push downstream.
I'd be interested in seeing that.
No, I understand, right. And that's some of the concerns that residents have asked us
Counterintuitive, I'd like.
regarding, and have asked us about Thalia Creek and the flooding. And our analysis indicate, and also based on the operation of the pump station, we will not cause additional flooding downstream. Now, there may be flooding downstream, but we aren't going to aggravate that flooding. This is just a concept drawing that shows Thalia Creek, Lake Windsor. To the west, to your left, is Mount Trashmore. This happens to be city-owned property, and Public Works has been working with Parks and Recreation for the use of this land. It's important for me to note that if it turns out that this is the location and these facilities are built, they will not have an adverse impact on Trashmore Park. Thousands of our residents go there throughout the year. So this will not have an adverse impact on all the amenities that our residents enjoy today at the park. And and this is another concept drawing. This is what the tide gates would look like. And as I indicated earlier, under normal conditions, I'd say probably 95% of the time, these tide gates will be open. You have the normal ebb and flow of the tide. Now, it's difficult for me to say 95% because I cannot predict the weather. The weather will determine the frequency of when Public Works will need to close the gates at low tide. And as I indicated earlier, we're seeing more and more storms, greater intensity, and more frequent. But under normal conditions, like today, for example, these gates would be open. And based on the weather forecast, they would have been open over the weekend, and they'll be open the next couple of days for sure. All right, next slide, please. This is also a concept drawing along London Bridge Creek. This is along North London Bridge Creek. Shows the tide gate, the pump station, and the control building. Again, this is just a conceptual drawing. It is not an engineering drawing. Next slide, please. And this is South London Bridge at West Neck Creek. As I indicated, we would have a tide gate. We would do some channel work, but no pump station. The Green Run stormwater would continue down West Neck Creek as it does today, and the lake's stormwater would be directed north up London Bridge Creek to the pump station site in the storage area.
I know that's the kind of the fall line part that goes north part. Just where is that, like Ship's Corner or something that one way it goes north, the other way goes south?
Yeah.
And so you say this that goes to West Neck Creek, though, you're not going to be having a pump station on that side?
At this time, we do not envision a pump station.
This drains north back up Canal number 2.
But it still goes back up north, even though it comes West Neck Creek?
That's right, because of Canal number 2. Canal number 2 is south of this location.
And then that goes back up?
And it can go back, yes, ma'am.
Up to wherever that goes?
Yes.
Over there by London Bridge Road and so
Yes.
forth? Through the industrial park and so
Yes.
forth, all that, Canal number 2 up to wherever Mr. Waterfield designed it to go?
Eastern Branch.
Next slide, please.
Pep Boys.
Again, this is a, now, I've talked about storage and how important it is. And we talked about storage in the Windsor Woods area with Lake Windsor and Lake Trashmore. And so the big challenge was to find an area in Princess Anne Plaza in the lakes to create stormwater storage. It's needed to mitigate the flooding of homes. It's a fully developed area. We identified some green space, which is owned by the city. We identified in the earlier map, Bull Creek Golf Course and Northgate Park. At this time, we're focusing our attention on converting the Bull Creek Golf Course into a flood mitigation area plus a park. Public Works and Parks and Rec have worked together. The objective was to create a win-win situation for our residents. Create storage so you could mitigate flooding and increase park amenities. And both departments have worked together, along with Michael Baker, to develop this concept plan. This has not been finalized, but we've obviously spent some time with Parks and Rec and Public Works to develop this. You can see that we've got two functions here. We got park amenities and we got stormwater management. For the park amenities, there'll be passive uses like walking trails and a playground and overlooks. There'll also be active uses like pickleball courts and skate park features and a multi-purpose field. So, and this is approximately 100 acres in round numbers. So it's going to be a really nice park, and there's an expectation that there would create a lot of visitors to this park. I should point out, this is also a location of the Bull Creek Rec Center, which is very popular. The use of this area for a stormwater facility will have absolutely no adverse impact on the Bull Creek Rec Center. So all the benefits that people enjoy today, they will continue to enjoy in the future, assuming this conversion is made in the future. And this shows the park activities. And next slide, please. And so I also want to take a few minutes to kind of go through at a very high level how this would work in the context of flood mitigation. And there's really three areas there. The dark blue is a tidal influence channel. That's, in essence, Bull Creek. And you can see on a daily occurrence, it's connected to London Bridge Creek, of course, which is necessary. You might see a 1 to 2 foot variance on a daily basis in the blue area. The lighter blue really has two different areas. One is simply what we call the tidal influence floodplain storage, and you might see a variance of 2 to 3 feet, maybe a couple times a month with a high tide, for example, like a king tide. And in the upland storage, you could see water levels anywhere from 4 to 5 feet, but that might only occur once every 10 years. So in laying this out, we're going to use native grasses, and you'll have 3 different areas of floodplain. And intermixed with that are going to be park activities. Now, granted, during a major storm event, Parks and Rec will close potentially certain of the amenities so that people are not put in harm's way. I wanted to comment that this is a concept plan. Our next step is to take the concept plan out to the public, to give them an opportunity to review and comment on this plan. We'll take their comments and their thoughts into consideration. And then based on that, Public Works and Parks and Rec would come back together, and we would hope to develop not only a concept plan, but a final plan that could be used in later years for execution of the program. Next one, please.
John?
In your concept plan, are you going to consider, I know some communities have used this to minimize the amount of land they have to take, use impermeable clay, and they also use vinyl butyl kind of liners to give greater depth and prevents the water pushing up, so they can go to greater depth without water filtration, and therefore they can reduce the amount of land they have to take, or they can increase the amount of storage. I hope that you would look at that and part of your concept assessment, the business case of does or does that not make sense? But I know that is something that has been used by the localities where land is a concern.
Well, this concept plan that we developed would require us to remove about 1 million cubic yards of soil, which is a very significant undertaking.
Right.
But I understand your point.
But once you're in there
Yes.
and you're looking at the marginal cost, it might say, what's the surge capacity and what's that cost?
Yeah. We are suggesting that this program be implemented in 2 phases. Phase 1 would be the tide gates and the barriers, the pump station, and the storage. Phase 1 primarily focuses upon getting water out of the houses. It focuses upon reducing structural flooding. It also reduces roadway flooding, and I've got several charts to go through that. But phase 1 is priced out today at $225 million. As I said, it would include the pump stations, the tide gates, the barriers, and the storage, and a few stormwater projects that we currently have under design. So phase 1 is what we recommend the city move forward with first. Phase 2, let me get, next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I wanted to comment that if you'll notice, let me step over a minute and point this out. Yeah, fine, thank you. I want to bring your attention to this column. With no improvements made, as I indicated earlier, in Windsor Woods, we estimate 357 structures would be subject to flooding. At the end of phase 1, that number drops down to 46. The roadway flooding, with no improvements, is around 38,000, and it drops down to 21,000. So you can see you get a tremendous reduction in structural flooding with a less reduction in roadway flooding. And after phase 2, then that number drops to 19 and 170 feet. You can see the variances between phase 1 and phase 2. Next slide. This next slide is pretty busy. It's a graph of what I showed you on the previous one, and I just point out basically what it is saying here. Basically, when we get the end of phase 1, we have had an 87% reduction in structures and a 45% reduction in roadway flooding, and all the way out to the end, after you do all the storm drain improvements, you're at a 95% structure reduction and 99% on roadways. But we feel that it's more important initially to get the water out of the houses, even though you're still going to have street flooding. Next one. I want to talk. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure people watching. So you're saying the full FEMA benefit, at that point, you believe that all the property that's affected by those particular improvements would just be paying the normal risk flood insurance premium, is that correct?
That is correct. Now, there's a process that we have to go through. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but there is a FEMA process we have to follow in order to achieve that.
Right, I just want to let the public know what that really
Yeah,
means.
yeah. And let's look, okay, once again, on the lakes and the plaza with no improvement, you're looking at 621 homes and 42,000 roadway flooding. With phase one improvements, that drops about 50% to 20,000 on the roadway flooding and down to 79 for homes potentially subject to flooding. Tremendous reduction. At the end of phase two, we're down to about 5,000 feet and 13 homes. So once again, phase one is really focusing on dropping the number of homes potentially subject to flooding. And let's go to the next one, please. And this is, again, the same thing. You can see after we get to this point here, we're at 84% and 49, and then at the very end, 98 and 87%. So I guess to say that the more improvements you make, the greater reduction you get. Next one, please. We made several calculations just to illustrate, looking at Windsor Woods. At the end of phase one, we will have spent an estimated $74 million, and we identified the number of properties that would be protected, and we assumed an assessed value of $93 million. So at that point, you have the public investment is less than the value that you're protecting. At the end of phase two, though, the number is 154, and the number of structures is 101. The reason for that is we did not assign a dollar value to the reduction in roadway flooding. There's probably a way to do that, but we simply didn't do it. And this is just kind of a metric, it's an indicator of what you're protecting and what the public is spending. And the next one is in the lakes and the plaza. The numbers are a little bit different. At the end of phase one, we spent $151 million, and we protected 114. You don't seem to get the same relationship. The reason's quite simple. In the plaza and the lakes, we have to spend a great deal of money to create the storage, much more than we had to do in Windsor Woods. And secondly, the elevation on an average in the lakes and the plaza is about 1 foot less than the elevations in Windsor Woods. I know 1 foot doesn't seem like a lot, but over a large area, it makes a considerable difference.
Just two things I think we ought to mention. We showed the slide. One, this represents a huge inventory of affordable housing in our community, which has an intangible value, which I think we should not understate. And secondly, I don't know how we would forecast it, I have to work with FEMA, but as you reduce, because these improvements, the insurance they pay, there's a dividend to the individuals and therefore disposable cash flow in the economy that generates transactions. I don't know how we capture that, but ultimately, as hopefully we move towards this bond referendum in November of 2020, that we're able to articulate those other aspects that are beyond just the pure, which I do appreciate very much, the civil engineering calculations versus the second and third order effects, which I think really change the quality of life for people.
Yes, sir. Next slide, please. I want to summarize the phase one quickly. For the 10-year design storm in Windsor Woods and the lakes at the end of phase one, you can round those numbers off to a 50% reduction in the number of roadway flooding. At the end of phase one, it's 48 and 52, 50%. For the 100-year design storm in relation to structural flooding, as the numbers turn out, they're both at 87% reduction on both ones. We didn't cook the numbers, I promise you. It just turned out that it was 87%. But at the end of phase one, we estimate you still have 125 structures that are subject to flooding at the end of phase one throughout the whole project area, and almost 8 miles of roadway flooding. So there's still work to be done after the conclusion of phase one. And phase one is $225 million. Phase two is $129 million. I should have put that on the chart, for a total of $354. Next slide. FEMA. I don't know. I'm not going to go through all those steps, but let me summarize it if I would. FEMA has a process. If we, the city, Public Works, and the other departments, including Baker, if we can go, our goal is to go to FEMA, lay out the plan of what we propose to do, what the city proposes to do, get FEMA's comments up front prior to construction. And that kind of sets the foundation for the next steps. And the next step is where when we complete a project, we go back to FEMA and advise them of the project that's been completed incrementally and the benefits that flow to a certain group of residents. And the goal here is so that hopefully FEMA will make a modification in their flood insurance rate map. And so those individuals, those homeowners that get an incremental benefit from that particular infrastructure can go back to FEMA and seek lower rates, as you were speaking of earlier. So the goal, of course, is that we want to get to the point where homes are not in the floodplain in the long run. But even in the final analysis, after you do phase 1 and phase 2, there's a small number of homes that would still be subject to flooding.
Jess?
A question about the map revision process. So the idea is for us to initiate that process rather than the individual resident having to initiate it on a case-by-case basis.
Well, we have to initiate the first step up here, get this conditional letter of map revision. And we have to also initiate the letter of map revision. That's really on the burden of the city to do that. But it is my understanding that after we complete that second step for each infrastructure improvement, it would be the residents' responsibility. Now, do we have within Michael Baker some subject matter experts on the FEMA process? I'm not one of those, but we want to lay out, because the residents have a very high level of interest in obtaining insurance rates that are affordable. And this project will give that to them as we progress over time.
So my question is that, so theoretically, we're able to go to FEMA and say, please change this blanket.
Yes.
However, this is probably a question for Dave, maybe not. Let's say FEMA says, no, thank you, they're gonna have to go through their process as individuals. Do we have a notification system that we're gonna put into place so that these individuals can start that process as these things get completed, or, maybe?
Ms. Abbott, with 87% of over 950 homes all being impacted, the city's gonna step up. We're gonna be the advocate. We're gonna figure out a process. They're gonna be more than happy. We wanna be that poster child. We wanna be that, local jurisdiction providing for its own, removing this flood threat from our economic vitality and making everything. So, we're a long way from that, but this is great. I mean, this is a great engineering solution. It takes the most complex drainage area, Eastern Branch, Western Branch, and WestNet. All of a sudden, you're getting solutions here, and we'll lead that charge.
So my follow-up questions, you probably don't have an answer today. How are we going to address the people that receive grants and were forced to purchase flood insurance as a result, and then the people that are in severe repetitive loss properties that are also required to maintain flood insurance? Are we going to try to start an advocacy there as well? Because more and more of the properties in that red area are impacted by that, and they will, as the guidelines stand right now, they have to maintain flood insurance.
Right, but you're gonna see that red area just basically for $225 million.
But the property's still going to be
You're
considered
gonna see
severe
it shrink,
repetitive
you're
loss.
gonna see 125 spots that are gonna be, we're gonna go from neighborhood to individual sites. And you're gonna see us having to deal with those where their first floor elevation is at elevation 6, and you just can't get to them when they're, or 4, you just can't get that. And we're gonna have to make cost-benefit ratios, and the programs that we're talking about in the southern watershed are now going to evolve inside all these neighborhoods. We're gonna have to make a financial decision about how we're going to handle that repetitive loss issue.
well, my question is, and it's fine if it's at a later date, are we going to have a procedure for advocating for the people that get lifted out of the red zone through our improvements, but are still considered repetitive loss because they've had 2 or more losses through their flood insurance policy?
Well, they're gonna, the floodplain maps that FEMA produces will be changed because we've now created the engineering solutions that they validate that says you're not in a floodplain anymore. And said, because you're gonna be outside of a floodplain, that's going to affect your rates. Because you are a repetitive loss of past without the engineering solutions, I'm not sure that's an ongoing factor for what your future flood potential is going forward, having invested these kind of engineering solutions to prevent it from happening again.
Jessica, a friend of mine lived in Norfolk, and he raised his house like 7 feet, not the garage, and that exactly would explain. They reset his baseline because now his house, and he isn't paying that repetitive flood rate.
FEMA only wants to.
7 feet up off the ground.
You're right. They only gauge us based on being in a floodplain, and they analyze the floodplain, and if you're providing engineering solutions, elevation or burn pond and pump, you're creating the bowl and you're pumping it out, and you prove to them that you have backup generators on your pumps, that you have a capacity to reduce the BMPs to hold containment there, and you can prove that you can hold all the water in a 100-year storm inside that bowl, they will drop your rates. They will take you out of your current zone, and they'll move you to X, and we'll move on.
It will be an incremental process because we have to demonstrate to FEMA that we have built this infrastructure. They want to know that it's built, it's in the ground. They want to see the final construction plans before they make a decision to change the rate map. And we have to provide the evidence to them, the scientific engineering analysis that shows which residents received a benefit from that piece of infrastructure. And I think I have one more. I think I've exceeded my time limits as normal for me. Summary, as I said, phase 1 focuses on structural flooding. Structural flooding. You do get some road rate reduction, but the emphasis is to reduce the structural flooding risk. Phase 2 continues to give a further reduction in structures, but it really gives you a tremendous benefit in the reduction of street flooding. And then we just go to the bottom one. After phase 2, there's still some roads that would be defined as flooding, and there's 32 structures that would still not be mitigated in a 100-year design storm event. As the city manager was indicating, their elevations are so low that even spending the amount of dollars that we've estimated, there's still 32 structures subject to flooding. And with that, I think that's the end. And
Any questions? Guy?
Thank you, Mr. Longstaff.
Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. One has to do with what environmental concerns did you guys consider that you might encounter in getting this fully permitted?
Well, the work that we would propose to do, the tide gates and the pump stations and the channel work are all in the waterways. So we are required by state and federal law to go to the regulatory agencies and obtain permits. And we have specialists on hand that would navigate that for us. For example, we currently, one of the first projects out in the phase 1 would be the tide gates on Thalia Creek in Windsor Woods. We've already submitted an application to the Army Corps of Engineers and Virginia DEQ in December. And since that time, we've already had 2 additional requests for information. We're confident that we can certainly get the tide gates for Thalia. And one of the challenges that we have in selecting these locations is to try to find the location where we have a high level of confidence that we can obtain the permits. But it's not automatic and it's not guaranteed.
Thank you. One more question. You mentioned Lake Trashmore area where it was built on land that the city already owns. Would you talk just a little bit about the other areas and you didn't mention, but I know from previous conversations, at least one of those requires some private land.
Well, the other two sites that we've identified along North London Bridge Creek and South London Bridge Creek, at West Neck Creek, involve property that is not owned by the city. We are currently, I use the word, looking at alternative pump station sites. We're looking at what options exist on, say, a particular site in terms of the site configuration. So we've not made a final decision at this point as to where those sites will be on North London Bridge. And, well, on the South London Bridge, it appears the site that we've selected would be the most preferred. But we're still working with Public Works. Public Works is reviewing our analysis, and we've had meetings with them, and we'll continue to.
Yeah, I noticed one of them's on a commercial site, I would think would be pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our process, the first step in the process of locating sites is, will it work from an engineering standpoint? The second, is there property that's undeveloped? And then third is, if you selected a particular site, what are the cost implications of that site? So there are a lot of, actually there's pros and cons to each site. And we're, of course, working with Public Works, going through that analysis. They're reviewing what we've done. And we've not made a final decision on which site has not been made yet.
Plus, you want to try to contain your footprint. But you're challenged as a city. And your drainage is where your drainage is, and your receiving waters are where your receiving waters are, but there will be challenges going forward, Mr. Tower.
I'm very interested in that engineering staging, though. When you get to phase 2 and you find one is an undeveloped piece of property, the other one is developed, do you even get to, you still get to the third question?
Well, we try to look at it from a comprehensive manner.
Okay.
Yeah,
But there are.
That's not the end of it, just because your
no,
two choices.
no, but
one's
it's a
developed,
process we go through.
There are circumstances whereby those houses that you see that are still the 125, they're going to be inundated. There are circumstances by which if you relocate the infrastructure necessary, maybe you can acquire those as opposed to a yet undeveloped piece that has high ground and could potentially develop into something else. And you could scratch several itches, if you will, by taking out those that you really can't save. And those ratios that you saw, if you're getting 87% of all your properties in phase 1 at 225 versus that 350 or what 56 or whatever it ends up being down there, another 125 million. I mean, this council, several of the senior members here, we've already been through that conversation in your district. It was your district before. I'm not sure it's still in the Centerville district, but we went through those evaluations and we made a conscious decision. But we are now talking, instead of a $6 million pump station that we did there adjacent to Stumpy Lake, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars here and lots of earth moving around. So we have a long way to go. We're going to have criteria. Cost certainly is it. Outcome, benefits of outcome. What is the opportunity cost that you give up of what you can do with it? Those analyses are going to come back to you all. Those are executive session discussions that we'll have in closed session because we're talking about, how do you move in and take properties you don't have? But where we can, we're going to stay inside the properties that you own as a government body. And, what you're getting here are concepts and watercolors on paper, but we're educating you in the burn, pond, and pump, and now we're moving into the engineering aspects.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Mr. Warren's staff, and all of your staff. You've been very generous with your time.
Well, thank you for your time, members of council. Thank you.
Michael?
I wonder if you could share a little bit more information about the timeline for some of the projects that you described. I think that the public watching and others would be interested in knowing and even in an ideal scenario, what implementation would look like and how long that would be, that may be. And that's my first question. I have one other after that.
Well, in terms of the execution of the program, we will take our direction from the Director of Public Works in accordance with the funding available in the capital program. That would be our marching orders.
I wonder if you could share any more detail on that.
Sure. The first project we're going to go after is the Thalia Tide Gate. That's over by Mount Trashmore by the park. That'll give us one of the biggest bangs for the buck for Windsor Woods. We're also going to start working on creating storage over in Princess Anne Plaza, and we're going to focus on that. And those are the two main things we're going to go after first. And then followed up will be the pump station up at North London Bridge Creek, and then working on the West Neck Creek area also. In addition, what you're going to see in the short term is we have three drainage projects within Windsor Woods and Princess Anne Plaza that's already funded. We're wrapping up the design. We're getting ready to go to construction, and I can get you the construction time frame for that. In addition, we've applied for 2 or 3 flood mitigation grants. 2 grants, and we've heard they're progressing through, and I think they're up to FEMA. We hope to hear something from them, in about a month or 2?
Hopefully by July.
Hopefully by July, we'll hear if we've gotten those awards also. If we have, we'll take off, and we will work on those piping projects also.
Take off right away. So, I mean, I guess that's my question. I think that certainly my neighbors and members of the public are looking for a sense of what's happening right now, what could happen in the immediate and intermediate timeline, as well as into the future, and any more information about when they can expect that would
So,
be.
Michael, before you came on council, but you were sitting in the bleachers, so you know that we built that 15-year program. We stepped out in front of the council and said, hey, look, we're gonna build you a 15-year program to handle all the projects that we've thought of across the city. And so those are all in this 15-year plan, and we are taking as Clarence talked, instead of 3 CIPs, meaning big Windsor Woods, big Princess Anne Plaza, big lakes, we took it to 9 projects, 5 and 4, and those are in a CPM that is associated with the financing as we laid out to you in the long-term 15-year financing. It's subject to council approval. It's subject to additional real estate tax that'll be supportive at incremental periods because they can only design and permit at a certain speed. You can throw all the money in the world at it, but you can't get through those federal and state
And that's why I was
permits.
asking about the timeline,
So,
because I
so
think
this is a realistic Tony is the keeper of the spreadsheet, and she's the chief engineer in charge of stormwater. She's gonna be refining this, and we're gonna be able to put this out there so that people get an idea when that's happening. Sure, we'd love for it all to be fixed tomorrow, and it would be good, but I guarantee you, this is as fast and as dedicated as we can go, and we're gonna get a sense from the federal and state agencies on the permitting process about their acceptability of this, and we think it'll pick up steam.
And Tony's coming to see you on the 11th of June to give you the quarterly status report. We'll take a look at it and see if we can't identify what's coming up for construction.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
And I'd just like to comment, it's good to see you back, Clarence.
Thank you, sir.
And for those of you who are not familiar with Clarence, he's one of the heroes of Lake Gaston. And he was the manager of public utilities at the time, and great guy to have on board. Good to see you, Clarence.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your kind remarks. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize several people in this room. One, of course, is Deputy City Manager Tom Leahy. Mr. Leahy was the Water Resources Manager, and he did an outstanding job. I must also recognize the council, and with a special recognition to Councilman Lewis Jones for the courage and the commitment that this council displayed over the 15 years on what appeared to be unsurmountable odds against us. So the city council of this city deserves a strong pat on the back for your courage and your leadership. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Moss?
I have one comment. I do believe this is not as fast as we can go. The city of Houston issued a $2 billion bond referendum. They are moved on a much more aggressive rate. I do think if we took a different acquisition strategy and looked at big firms like Bechtel and people who do international scale projects, that we could move at a faster pace. And I remind council today that the 10-year treasury note was 2.269%. That is like a 40-year low. There's never been a better time to be in the bond market than now in terms of cost of money. And I do believe that we may be constrained by talent in the short run, but that talent is purchasable, and the people who do sizable projects much bigger than this on an international scale are out there. And if you have the big enough upfront project and the big enough upfront dollars, they move into the market, and we could move at a faster pace. And it has been done elsewhere. Not to be argumentative, but I take exception.
Okay, anybody else? Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Manager, we have a ambitious agenda, and guess we have a very interactive council, and we're not going to discourage that because a lot of this stuff is thing, but I have to be at ODU for a energy presentation at 7, okay? And, you know, I just think that in the future, we got to do a little bit better on time management.
Well, we can always start earlier,
Yeah, but,
and we can shift several of these briefings.
Okay.
But we do have to do pending items, pending planning items. I think that's essential for you all to do that. We can shift the interim. We do have some planning items, so I'd like to, we pushed Bonnie out. Let's do Bonnie and then planning items. And so Taylor, would you jump on there? And we'll probably stretch this to about 1:15. Can we do that?
Oh,
okay, can we
This
be
is
out
great.
about quarter after?
Yeah,
I'm very interested in this topic.
yeah. So Taylor,
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor,
this is
Council.
probably the third time we've talked about Bonnie, so you can get into some particulars on this.
That's right, and I'll move through these first slides quickly, the idea being that we just wanted, again, as we have done this for you a couple of times, have replaced a lot of the history with just some maps that we thought were interesting. But just to reorient you, of course, you see the red star there is the site in question. Here's a quick listing of disclosures. I won't read those to you. Let you have a quick second to look at those before we dive in. All right, great. So as we've shown you the history on this three or four times, I thought we'd start with a broader look of the region. You can see this is an aerial that we actually got from the developer. We think this is about 1998, maybe 1999. You can see Thalia Creek weaving sort of through there, and then what you
Pointer.
thank you. Thalia Creek coming through here. Town center now sits over here. The site in question is right here, which interestingly enough was a transfer station before it was the convergence center. Or this is and this is to show you, excuse me as I'm moving quickly, an example of what of some of the developers' prior work in the area. Here again is the transfer station. Here is our site in question right now. Thalia Creek coming back through there. Here's how it looks today. You'll notice Thalia Creek has moved a little bit. That was some city investment in the project. Here is what used to be a transfer station. Here again is our site in question, and here's now Town Center sitting in the background. What we're again, continuing with the theme of what the developer's done in the region. This developer in question, it's Olympia Development, pays $625,000 a year in real estate taxes at Convergence now. The Residence Inn has just completed. We have the ribbon cutting for that this week. That's not included that's not yet on the rolls. 1,000 employees working in the district, and then $26,000 in stormwater fees annually. We only added this just to show, as you've seen the history of this site or the history of this project a few times, but something new that we had not told you is the work that this developer had done in the region and the impact that he's had. And so we thought it provided nice context to show that he builds us a nice product. Here's the site in question again. This is just showing you an aerial, and then you can see the Thalia Creek Greenway laid in there on top of it. Just To quickly review the challenges, we've got heavy wetland impact on the back. Our wetland study showed about 7.5 acres that were developable. An appraisal that was obtained by Public Works Real Estate shows about 5.78. Here is a preliminary site plan that we have received from the developer. Office building here and here, multifamily here, multifamily built around a parking deck here, and then this is a parking deck as well with some proposed ground floor retail. Now, talking about retail on this site, we're not talking about storefronts like you might see at Town Center. This is more, I would say, it's retail that has sort of less, I would tell you, less traffic impact. The offer, as it started, for the total site, 11.7 acres. We're still showing the 7.5 developable. Again, 5.7 out of the appraisal that's referenced here. Developer originally offered us 1.8. It was assessed at 1.7 million. A $50,000 deposit to be made upon execution of the agreement. But important to note, property was recently appraised for $2.3 million. Developer has agreed to that number. The development gets 3 phases as it sits today. Professional office of between 100 and 140,000 square feet. Why 100 to 140,000? We're still working through what the soils there will carry, but we are confident that this is an appropriate range. Multifamily of 240 units. Parking, 782 spaces at 15,000 per space. All of the construction costs that we're using there, we're running off of the developer's estimates. Again, the deal as it sits today, the deal requests $11.7 million in participation for parking. That would be through a deal similar to what you did for City View 2, a use of real estate taxes to pay back debt that the developer incurred for the parking. And then from the Development Authority by way of an EDIP Part B, roadway, $142,000 for roadway, $410,000 for undergrounding of stormwater, $52,000 to increase off-site sewer capacity. All told, that's a $604,000 investment. So again, just a quick review, $2.3 million in land, $75 million in improvements, and then also an EDIP of $604,000. The project is in the Town Center TIF. All of the public investment in the project is performance-based. And then one last thing to mention, we've had conversation with the developer in the last week about the establishment of an SSD. We're working through that with the attorney's office. That is, but the developer has agreed to that in concept, but we need to finalize that portion of the deal. Just to give you an idea to just show you, one, that we are consistent with prior precedent that this body has established, but also so that you see the ratios that we're looking at. You'll see Town Center, City View 2, and Bonnie Road, the private investment versus the public investment, and then the ratio that created at 6.1 to 1, and that is inclusive of the $604,000 EDIP. We are well within in the ranges of what we've seen before. One more final note, just so you know, because there was a question that I received along the way, is were there any phases of Town Center in which we invested but also received an EDIP? There have been, through the 6 phases of Town Center, there have been EDIPs awarded in the neighborhood of $18 million. That is as quick as I can run through it. Are there?
Okay, Barbara.
In the SSD, what are the special services that he's going to be paying for?
We believe that is related to cost and usage of the public parking.
It will be like the TIF, like the other part of the TIF that's got in an SSD that pays the SSD for maintaining the parking and having it public? Is that what the SSD is for?
So this is where I would have to lean on the attorneys for the specific answer there.
We're working out the details. It would be key to parking facilities, which is defined in the SSD statute, but it would not pay for all of the parking facilities proposed. It would really just be a piece of it.
You don't know what his rate would be at this point.
But it would be an effort to offset some of the public monies directed at the parking.
That's right.
Hey, John?
I have a series of questions, but the first one's going to be, is it true or not that the developer, Olympia Development, Cecil Cutchins, came to the city with a proposal for that property which required no public subsidy and no tax rebates and no public participation.
So,
I'm just letting you know I have the answer. I'm just
oh,
trying to get
yes,
it in the
sir.
record.
So and this is where, in the interest of accuracy, since that conversation predates my time in the department, I just want to make sure I'm speaking truthfully within what I know. What I do know is, yes, that the developer brought us a proposal that is different from this one. Now, as it relates to whether public participation was required, none was requested in that proposal.
Correct. Now, is it true or not true that the staff and conveyed, whether implicitly or by inference, that absent developing it according to the SGA and including multi-use and housing for which the developer said there was no market for without a subsidy, that he was actually told that he would not be able to secure this property?
So I don't know the answer to the last part of that. What I can tell you conclusively is that this property is within the town center SGA, which is within the city's comprehensive plan. So yes, we absolutely, and this is in the original document, in the RFP that we submitted, that in conformity to the SGA, or that it was within the SGA and expected. So yes, we would have told him that the project needed to conform to the SGA principles consistent with the comprehensive plan.
Now, if I remember correctly, when I saw the appraisal that was done, it said about 5.9 acres were usable. You cited 7.5.
So,
Can you please explain the delta before I get to the actual appraisal?
oh, yes, sir. So we did a wetland study that demonstrated that 7.5 acres were usable. And if you'll remember from a prior version of this, we had a slide that was actually validated by the developer's engineer, where he showed that parcel breakdown and agreed to it. The appraisal that was then done came in at 5.78. This is where I'm not being an appraiser myself or an engineer, I'm probably not qualified to offer an opinion.
That takes me to the next step, because I did share with all the members of council about 2 Fridays ago the actual appraisal on the closed property for the school site on North Witch Duck Road. You may recall that there was 2 things that were appraised. That was like an 8-acre site on that site, something a little over 8 acres, maybe it was 10, I can't remember, but the price was $4.5 million for that, and that about almost per acre, it's about $450,000 an acre. All of it was usable, no wetlands, had its own restriction access, much like this does too. And in fact, they gave a higher appraisal of $7.5 million if it was zoned for business or other commercial use, and they actually sold it at the apartment appraisal since that was going to be the use. So now if the actual usable land is almost 2 more acres than what the appraisal was based on, and that appraisal per acre was lower than the appraisal for usable land for apartments only, and this has a higher and best use, how can the appraisal on a per acre basis that we're paying be less than what the school board received for North Witch Duck Road? This is not the first time I have posed this question. I've just never got an answer. But those 2 appraisals can't occupy the same square of truth.
So all I can offer in that space is, again, not being an appraiser, I'm not qualified to offer an opinion on that one. I can tell you sequentially, though, the wetlands delineation was done prior to the ordering of the appraisal. So the 5.78 it happened subsequent to the wetland delineation, which was last summer. But beyond that, it's just, I wouldn't be qualified to offer an opinion.
We paid for an appraisal that wasn't based on an accurate delineation of the project. Hope we can get our money back. Or still, because you're saying that he had knowledge, the delineation of the usable land was done before the appraisal, correct? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, sir. However,
Okay, so then the appraisal is not accurate because it only took into account in its evaluation 5.9 usable acres. So if there's more usable acres, there's greater value that we are not receiving. So that's just, I really can't answer this today, but I do want an answer before we vote. I think that's a fair thing we ought to get. And someone needs to look and explain to the public and to the council the variance between the appraisal done on North Witch Duck Road property and this property. Now, coming back to the issue of the why, if this is a private development with apartments and with retail, why are we paying for 100 public spaces? What's the public spaces doing for a private development?
So,
who's making his own parking to start with, which should be accounting for his customer, his retail, his residences, the residents' visitors. Why are we buying 100 spots?
so we would offer two things on that. One, this is immediately adjacent to the Thalia Creek Trail, which we do believe is an amenity to the public and to the property. Also, with the improved connectivity on Bonnie Road to Town Center, there conceivably, although probably not every day, there is the opportunity that some people might walk to either Convergence or to Town Center. I doubt it. More likely, it's the Thalia Creek Greenway.
Do you have analytical studies that support that the demand for the Greenway is 100 spaces? I'm looking at other
I do
places.
not.
So we don't know if we're buying to need or just buying to desire. Correct? 100 spots is $15,000 a piece is real money. I'm just kind of getting down to the
It
heart
is,
of it.
and on that, we just, again, our only goal there was to track with established precedent in the district.
Well, I think taxpayers' money analytics is a good idea. Lastly, did the Virginia Beach Development Authority endorse this project?
They deferred it pending the council action, sir.
So normally we get something from them first. I think that's been our normal process, correct?
I can't speak to that because this is your property, not theirs.
Let me have a question for the city attorney. Is it within the council's right if we perceive that the value of having the developer build this project without the benefit of public subsidies and therefore derive the economic benefit on day one of its construction, that's within our prerogative to decide and put so conditions on the sale of the property that we don't get this non-market-based social engineering outcome? Because that's basically what this accounts for. It's saying the marketplace, and I've talked with the developer, doesn't support this development without public subsidy. But he can build a development that has market demand and make money and give us dollar on the first day that we need and isn't building something that the marketplace is saying there's no demand for at the moment and maybe never. Do we have the authority to do that?
You have the authority to give that direction.
All right, thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Hey, anybody else? Yes.
We're getting a lot of emails about this being FEMA and flood zone and all that. Can you address that, please?
So there is a considerable portion of this site with wetland impact. Basically, everything back here has wetland impact as well as there's impact over here. Now, it's important to note that the reason that the current plan requests undergrounding of stormwater is because we can't detain stormwater in the wetland. And so the plan was, given the density of the development, to underground the stormwater here beneath this plaza. And so where I think people have concerns about the wetland impact and the fact that there's a creek here, I would tell you that the developer's plan addresses those concerns. That said, I don't know the specific questions that they have been asking, but the developer has considered the impact on the wetlands and the area in his design to date.
Well, we've been getting emails to say deny it because it's in a flood zone, so.
Gotcha.
Could I just follow up on
Sure.
that to say, could you describe in some greater detail, and if that's not within your area of expertise, maybe defer to someone else, to help everyone understand what is a FEMA flood zone and what are the restrictions imposed upon construction or development inside of a FEMA flood zone?
So I would have to defer to other professionals within the city to speak to the specifics of the development within flood zones.
I'll let the planning director take that, if that's okay with you, Mayor.
Yep. A flood zone is based on the level of water that would rise during a specific storm event. You've heard in your last presentation, 100-year storm event. They model it to come to a certain level. Everything that's within this zone where that water would come has to be built to a higher standard, typically above that level. For us here in the city of Virginia Beach, it's 2 feet higher than that level to protect the building. Everything underneath it can have flood vents or be protected otherwise, but it does need to be either elevated or dry flood proofed, which keeps the water out to that level. The property does have some floodplain on it where there's potential for flooding. Not all of the property is covered by the floodplain.
And I really hadn't finished.
Okay,
before-
Rosemary, then
Michael
Sabrina.
said. So what John was talking about and this proposal, can you do an economic analysis of what John was talking about? Not this minute, but
Well, we've actually already done the fiscal impact work to determine what this project looks like with and without public subsidy. We worked with the assessor's office to develop what would be a reasonable revenue projection. We also worked with finance to determine what likely debt service scenarios look like, and then we used the developer's debt model, which was a 25-year amortization at the discount rate that he provided. We can demonstrate that the long-term value of having the denser form of development generates more for the taxpayer. And why do we choose that again? We're tracking with why do we ask for that? Tracking with the city's existing comprehensive plan, it asks for mixed use in this specific SGA, and so we did ask the developer to do that and then costed it accordingly. There is a way to do. It would just be, again, the policy guidance that we have to date is to do it within.
But just saying more isn't very definitive.
So it's $3.7 million net present value over 25 years with the full form of development. We anticipate that if you were to lose, that at a minimum we lose the second office tower. That's about as far as the developer could take us based on the conceptual phase that we are now. We can tell you that has a give or take $2 million effect on the net present value. If there was to be no public subsidy and we were to fall back to just the baseline, it's likely that we end up with just an office building, and then the BMP and the parking for that office building takes up the rest. I do not have what a single office building minus the multifamily looks like from a net present value standpoint, but conceptually it would be lower.
Can you put that in our Friday packet?
Sure, of course.
It's not
Joe,
just
John,
net
then
present
Lois.
value, it's also the opportunity cost of the positive cash flow that you get in the near-term years, and that is not taken into account in
That's a
that
valid
present
point.
value analysis.
Thank you, Councilman. That's valid, yes,
Okay,
sir.
excuse me, Sabrina first, then Lois. My
question
apologies.
is really quick. I, just following up on what Councilmember Wilson said about the concerns in the flooding, that this area is in a flood zone. Can I get details on what the developer is required to do to mitigate that flooding in that area?
Can we give that to you on Friday?
Sure, if you
Thank
can
you.
get that information to me, because I understand that sometimes if you're continuing to develop in those areas, you can make the problem worse. And I certainly want to take that into consideration before voting on the
Yes, ma'am.
project.
Thank you.
Okay, Lois?
The developer, at least in the past, has, for the most part, done office development.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any reason to believe, or what reason do you have to believe that he wouldn't build a second office building if he didn't have this?
So this is in conversation that we have had with him. The conversation focused on this first building for which he had an immediate need, and the multifamily, which I think was also something that he felt was an immediate opportunity. Also, we were trying to maintain our mixed-use principles as outlined in the SGA. So the scenario that we've run to date was what happens if we don't underground the parking, which is where the bulk of, the need for the public subsidies.
Underground the stormwater.
Excuse me, thank you, Mr. Manager. Underground the stormwater, and then the structured parking to support the use here and here. So if we did not underground the stormwater, then we're only left with the opportunity to basically, we get a BMP here, and you wouldn't need a garage, you would surface park it. And so the scenario that we've run is to park this 60,000 square feet and to create a BMP here.
The surface lot.
The surface lot, yes, sir.
So-
Now,
so-
we've got to rerun
so
without
look-
this.
Mr. Jones, what you're really reducing this space into is a single building, a BMP, and a surface lot. And it's significant.
But if you underground the stormwater, you can still build two office buildings.
Right, and that's what the EDIP
So
does.
then
is it-
you're only talking about $604,000 in EDIP.
To get a direct increase in the net present value of about $1.7 to $2 million additional
But-
capacity over 20 years.
And the question becomes, and I don't have this number here to date, just because, again, this is just haven't run the scenario. I don't know what we can park here. I mean, conceptually, I don't know if we can carry another. So if we get 60,000 here, and let's say you could get another 60,000 square feet, I don't know that we can carry the parking on the space that we've got left here. We've also got a drainage easement that cuts through here, as well as, again, I just don't know the answer to that standing here today.
Probably need to look into that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, anybody else at this point? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Manager, at this point, I believe the planning item for June 4th is being deferred. Bobby?
Yes, sir.
So at this point, could I respectfully recommend, since I have at 7 o'clock at ODU, I have to, and Mr. Wood and maybe some other folks have it, if we defer the Anita Webland House item discussion till next Tuesday?
Check.
And then we have the presentation of the
Interim
agenda,
next week.
the June 18th agenda presented to us next Tuesday. Would that be okay?
We can do the 18th, but do you have any planning items on the 4th?
Just
Yeah,
the
just the
thing
one.
that's being deferred.
We have the Anita Buda.
Just this one, and we'll push
Piney Grove.
that out, so we can terminate time now.
Okay. Okay.
Unless you want to have an interim financial statement brief,
No,
but I
I-
think we're past that time.
No, I'll tell you.
And we'll do that next week.
Yeah, they schedule me at 7 for something I have to be at.
Other people might have things to do.
Okay? Okay, thank you much. I appreciate everybody's interactivity. We are adjourned.